So we're going to look at the concept of sin. So if we recall, our original goal, as described in the book of Genesis, is to be in relationship with God and as gods, right? So there's a sense in which God wants us to be in relationship to Him, but not as so as superior to an inferior, but to the greatest degree possible as equals in some way. So that's the overall context for our relationship with God. And so, in that context, then we can talk about sin, which is sort of a deviation from that original plan. So, there are different kinds of sin we'll talk about. There is original sin, we'll talk about social sin, and then we'll talk about personal sin, and there's two kinds of that. And we'll talk about the different components that make something, a certain kind of personal sin, a mortal sin. So, original sin is the sin of the first parents, and that's the first parents are Adam and Eve, as reflected in the book of Genesis. All human beings are affected by that original sin. So, that's that first sin in which Adam and Eve disobey God by eating of the fruit they were instructed not to eat. And so, in so doing, all humanity is affected by the that sin. Everyone's sort of tainted by that, and all of humanity's relationship with God is ruptured and wounded in some degree. And so this is what the Christian story is about, that Jesus Christ came to reverse and reverse the effects of that sin and to restore access to God. But original sin is the basic sin that infects or affects all human beings, and it's what makes us fall short of our original goal to start with. So that's going to be there always in the background, the pull or the effects of original sin. Now, there's another concept of sin we'll look at very briefly, which is social sin. And this is described as a sin against justice or a sin against love of neighbor. Now, social sin is a relatively new concept in the Catholic framework. And it's a somewhat difficult concept because it's not sin that you can necessarily ascribe to an individual, but it's a way of recognizing that you can set up your society in such a way that it sort of calcifies or it creates an imbalance or injustice against a group of people. So, for instance, if you set it up so that certain groups of people, by virtue of some sort of characteristic, are not able to receive just wages or are not able to receive um, justice in any form, right? That's a social sin, right? So it's a way of recognizing that societies can be set up in ways that are just inherently sinful, right? Because they oppress certain groups of people and they do not promote love of neighbor. Now, social sin is always difficult because very often we're either born into it or we may not even realize we're participating in it. But the idea of social sin is to make us realize that we, in some way, own um, the way our society is set up. So we do have a responsibility to try to ensure that our society is just. So it requires often a lot of self reflection. Sometimes it's things that we don't see or realize. And in other cases, it's, for instance, in the case of slavery or in a case where people are denied certain rights, it's pretty evident. So that's a concept, social sin. This one's pretty hard because it's not always the case you can attribute it to an individual, but in some way we want to recognize that we all own it, and sometimes we set up our society in ways that we have sinned against justice and love of neighbor. Now, then we'll go to a more traditional sense of sin, which is personal sin. So when we think of sin, very often we think of personal sin. And personal sin is a deliberate act. So again, we note that it's deliberate, it's a choice that negatively affects our orientation to God. So don't think of personal sin in terms of a ledger in which you do wrong things and someone's, sort of checking the wrong things that you've done. But think of it in context of virtue. We've talked about virtue as a development of character in light of orienting us towards good or towards God. And so personal sin is a deliberate act that affects that orientation to God. So we don't want to think in terms of personal sin as individual acts that sort of, pile up, but we want to think of it in terms of something that affects our orientation to God. So you can imagine yourself on a road going towards God, and sin is the kind of thing that tries to bump you up that path. Now, because we're thinking of sin in this way, there really is no such thing as private sin. All sin harms the community's relationship to God. So even when you commit a sin that's only known to you, or you might think it just affects you in some way, everyone's involved in that. So all sin is not a private thing in the Christian community. It never has been a private thing. It's always been considered something that has an effect in the whole community. Now, in terms of personal sin, there's two kinds of sin. There's mortal sin and there's venial sin. So we'll take venial sin first. So simply put, these are the sorts of things that they are deliberate sins, but they don't rise to that very serious level, right? So these are morally evil choices that don't spring from the deepest levels of our knowledge and freedom, right? So very often sometimes they're instinctive, the things that just not that bad. If someone asks you, how do I look? And you say, great. And they don't look great. Okay, that may be a venial sin, especially if there's no consequence to that, right? Um, and you can multiply these. There are many of these that they're not the worst things in the world, but it is sin, and you do want to avoid them because too many of them, and you begin to affect your character, right? So they are serious, but not that serious. Then we have another category called mortal sin. And so this is an act that constitutes a radical turn from God to a finite reality. So what does that mean? So in general, in our path towards our fulfillment, which is a path towards the good, our path towards God, we keep our eye on the prize, which is the ultimate good, which is God. Now, but there are times when in our lives we make decisions in which, when we think about what we've done, we have substituted that goal of God with something finite. So maybe we've turned away from God because we're seeking honor or glory, or because of someone, friend or something else, of our greed. We want money or something, right? We've turned away from God because of something that we desire. Okay, so that is when you have a mortal sin, right? You've done something serious. You've done something wrong, and in some way, you weren't acting because you're motivated for God. You were acting because you're motivated by something else. Now, there are three components of a mortal sin. So, one is that there has to be serious and grave matter. That means the physical act, the thing that everyone can see, has to be serious. There has to be sufficient reflection. So, you have to know what you're doing, and it has to be full consent of will. So, serious and grave matter, what we're talking about here is that there has to be a material action, right? Something that people can see, a physical action that affects or violates an important moral value, right? So imagine, for instance, if you hit someone, right? So, or let's say you cut off someone's leg, right? Everyone can see that. Everyone can see you've violated something. You've infringed on someone else's bodily integrity by sawing off their leg or something like that. So there has to be a serious or grave matter, something that a material action. Material just means something that is visible, tangible. Okay, so that's the first thing. Then there has to be sufficient reflection. So that means you need to have an appreciation of value that's being violated. So you need to know that you've done something um, wrong. And um, so with mortal sin, there's usually there has to be time for reflection, that what you're doing is wrong. And we mean this we've talked about evaluative knowledge, and in that sense, we're not talking about speculative moral knowledge, right? But evaluative moral knowledge, where you know deep within that you're doing something wrong. So that has to be present for it to be a mortal sin. And then the last component is that there has to be full consent of will. That means you made the choice, and nothing made you make it. It's your choice. Now, this is always a tricky thing because in our day and age, we're finding more and more things that influence us, and there's always the question: to what degree are we truly free? Okay, but let's put aside some of those concerns and just say it is possible um, to make a free choice, right? And a choice in which you can be held responsible for. Okay, so there has to be full consent of the will. But we want to acknowledge that there are cases in which our personal freedom is limited by internal and external factors. So sometimes we act out of fear, right? We do something wrong because it's there's fear. There's sometimes there's extreme social pressure. Um, Sometimes we act out of ignorance. We don't really understand what we're doing. Sometimes we act out of erroneous thinking. We don't realize that what we've been taught a certain way, right? Sometimes with violence, we're forced to do things. Sometimes we've gotten into really bad habits. Sometimes there's physiological influences. So, you might have certain influences in your body that make you think a certain way and make you act a certain way, right? So these are all things that might be mitigating factors. That means that if they're present, perhaps you could say there wasn't full consent of the will. Okay, but the idea though behind mortal sin is that um, you are making an action in which there's an alternative, and you could have stopped yourself from making that action. Okay, at least at some point. So, mortal sin again, there's three components. It has to be a serious or grave matter. There's something tangible that you've done. There has to be sufficient reflection. That means you have had time to think about it, even if it's a few seconds. Yeah, yeah, you've had sufficient time to reflect and know that you're about to do something wrong, and there has to be full consent of the will. So it's a case where you make a choice, knowing you have an alternative, and there was a point at which you could have stopped yourself from doing that. Okay. So those are three components of mortal sin, and that will conclude our discussion of sin in general.